Welcome to today's webinar on human rights risk assessment and due diligence. I am Simoni Rathod from Lodha and Company ESG Practice. Lodha and Company is an 80-year-old assurance and advisory firm with 6 offices all over the country. Today's webinar topic is on human rights risk assessment and due diligence. The purpose of the webinar is purely educational, and any kind of compliance-related decisions shall be referred to a professional advisor. In case of any questions during the session, participants can raise their hands or post them in the chat box, and we will be happy to address them after the session. Participants are requested to stay on mute at all times during the session. Every day, the operations of a business organization and its value chain have an impact on the human rights of individuals. These impacts might relate to the issues including forced and child labor, privacy, freedom of speech, equality, gender discrimination, occupational safety, and so on. Growing stakeholder interest and new regulatory demands set an expectation that companies should acknowledge and address human rights of both their own operations and that of the value chain participants. In today's webinar, we will delve into practical implications of the human rights paradigm business through relevant case studies. Now, I would like to pass on the virtual floor to Mr. Manishankar Prasad, who is an experienced business and human rights professional with extensive experience in modern slavery and forced labor assessments in global value chain from Southeast Asia to India to Middle East. Currently, he is the Vice President of ESG practice in Lodha and Company.
First of all, many thanks for the kind introduction and a very valuable introduction as well, Simone. And welcome all, morning, afternoon, evening, to all the participants this Friday. We are talking on a very important emergent issue in the ESG space, which is on human rights impact assessment, risk assessments, and due diligence. These are various tools of evaluation, but we will be mainly delving into why human rights and its emphasis in the ESG landscape is vital for businesses, for investors, and for communities as a whole, in order to have a look into this very important space, which concerns livelihoods, it concerns health and safety, it concerns the future of work, honestly. And there are so many aspects to the human rights discourse as well, vis-a-vis business. And this is just a small primer through a few examples, case studies, and how human rights and business intersect and are entangled and diverge as per context, as per geography, and as per the legal mechanisms which honestly businesses follow. So I will move on to the next slide. So honestly, we are talking about human rights over here from an ESG standpoint, from an ESG lens standpoint, and the ESG landscape has been very fluid. I would request the Simone, can you mute the participants? Yeah, thank you so much. I would request all the participants to stay on mute, and we can have a conversation later after the half an hour, 40-minute presentation. So ESG overall is a very dynamic and diverse landscape. It's a very fluid landscape as a whole. So ESG is environmental, social, and governance, right? So environmental is normally biodiversity, carbon, water footprint. It's health and safety as well in a way, but it's mostly social in nature. So what really happens is the ESG landscape has been on the forefront ever since the Paris Climate Accords in 2015, and there has been a lot of efforts towards moving the world and the business ecosystems towards that positive paradigm. But this landscape has also very diverse implications, because the global north, the Western countries, Japan, are are obviously more conversant with the language of ESG and sustainability because they have higher per capita incomes vis-a-vis the global south, where a lot of the historic carbon emissions have been stored, and the implications of climate change, which is heat stress and flooding, has caused a lot of havoc and mayhem for a lot of countries. And businesses are global entities. Uh, Normally, businesses are as powerful as countries, and they have hundreds of operations all over the world, and they have global supply chains which almost work like spider web networks. And the ESG also can be visualized as a dynamic risk network in which uh, all these elements of environmental and social and governance are all risk factors for a business organization, and they shift, and the valencies and the potencies uh, kind of vary as per the context they are being expressed in. So there are various ESG frameworks being bandied about nowadays, such as the ISSB, which has come up with S1 and S2. There is also TCFD for carbon, TNFD for nature, CSDD, the EU law, and the German supply chain law, which is purely from a human rights angle. There are a plethora of local laws all the time. In an Indian context, there is a BRSR. Uh, the BRSR has got a number of social and human rights indicators uh, in it, honestly speaking. So it has been an eclectic landscape over the past 1 year, where we can see various framework, policies, and laws being really applied um, uh, all the time in various contexts over here. And of course, the topic of this presentation is mainly HRDDs and the human rights element, but it is important to foreground this entire conversation in a broader ESG sort of thought process. And ESG, with its various frameworks and laws happening all over the world, on a country level, on a macro level as well, on a transnational regulatory voluntary landscape standpoint, is turning out to be a regulatory burden for many companies. So which framework do you follow? What do you sign up on? Do you sign up on SBTI? Do you sign up with EU CSDD? Or do you think about the EU carbon border tax? Or if you're a garment manufacturer in the global south, do you think about human rights due diligence, and what kind of management systems do you implement then in order to adhere to these emergent compliance norms? And in an era of transnational litigation, uh, uh, every small thing which happens in a value chain, in a very complex global value chain, is extremely challenging for organizations and companies to meet. So, so how do you think of these things without having a cognitive overload? So one way to think through the ESG landscape is through a web of risks, to think through it through a system dynamics lens, to a systems lens in which you look at the context, you look at the materiality of the organization, and then you think through the what do I need to adhere to. Of course, there are national laws which needs to be adhered to in a hierarchy of compliances, but uh, as organizations are transnational actors, their value chains, the SMEs as well, are a part of this global web of compliances. So carbon, as we all know, through scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, through ISSB, S2, uh, is practically the default measure in the E of the ESG. But slowly but surely, human rights is the S default in the ESG paradigm, to be honest, because human rights is becoming through the various plethora of laws being coming up, standards being coming up from the EU, from the US, from Canada, and the modern slavery legislations earlier on, uh, it is being slowly being uh, uh, fructified, slowly being calcified into something which can be measured. And through this presentation, we'll present a few key performance indicators which are a part of this business and human rights landscape, which businesses need to measure and monitor and need to keep into check in their ESG management systems. What about the interoperability of standards, right? There are so many of these frameworks, so many of these laws. So, uh, so if you measure for one thing, does it stand valid for something else? So, for example, if you do something for BRSR in India, will the same data be valid for ISSB, for example, or TCFD, or for example, the EU CSDD in terms of human rights legislations? The answer is yes, because most of these frameworks are derived from each other, and they have not emerged in a void or vacuum. So they're completely interoperable. A lot of these frameworks by central bank regulators uh, are also drawn upon and built upon other international frameworks. So the era of interoperability, of the flattening of standards, of creating a global regulatory regime through the ESG landscape is happening, and it will slowly be implemented in the next 1 year with ISSB and the US Securities and Exchange Commission coming up with the carbon and ESG reporting frameworks in October. So on to the next slide. Okay, the context of human rights within the ESG space is very important. Uh, Businesses, companies get extremely annoyed, rather, for a lack of better word. They get really concerned upon hearing the word human rights. They often suggest or tell that it's too political in nature, it's too controversial in nature. They say that it is activistic in nature. But human rights in an ESG construct or a context is rather operational rather than dogmatic or philosophical in nature. There are concrete indicators uh, to measure what exactly is the performance metric for worker salaries being paid before the 7th of the month, which is under Indian labor law as well. Whether employees are being rendered uh, basic welfare services on site, for example, a creche for women, uh, drinking water facilities, whether they have a midday break in the construction site during the height of the summer in the Gulf. So these are some of the things which are rather operational and rather focus on the well-being of the employee and its stakeholders in the value chain uh, rather than think about it in a very um, rather for the lack of a better word in an activist sense. So human rights over here is if you think about international financial standards performance standard 2, it talks about worker welfare. It talks about freedom of association for employees in a large labor-centric organization. How does human rights translate into a context which is labor intensive, such as construction, such as mining, such as even delivery work nowadays in a platform ecosystem, rather than for a desk employee sitting in a technology company in Seattle, for example. So for a technology company in the United States, DEI or diversity, equality, inclusion measures might be more significant than, for example, the freedom of association, which might be more important for a manufacturing outfit in the global south, or for a mining community in which resettlement has been activated, for example, whether they are paid adequate uh, compensation by either the state or the company, because mining is very important in the climate transition context. So, so these are some of the things which are super important, right, to happen, because these are mainly for welfare measures, and there are key performance indicators within the ESG paradigm. Especially if you see the BRSR framework, there are concrete um, indicators even within BRSR code, which has to be assured. So human rights are mainly informed by the United Nations General Principle on Business and Human Rights, which is benchmarked against the UN Human Rights Convention in 1948, the recently updated ILO decent work standards, which has included health and safety in a radical shift to include health and safety as a part of safe work, as a part of the decent work standards. There are also 12 ILO forced labor indicators, which are very, very clear, having this context, which is very important in an industry like fishing, in an industry like palm oil, for example, where a lot of traffic labor can be used, or even in critical resource mining. And there are a slew or a plethora of modern slavery laws and legislations, right from Australia to the UK to even Canada right now, which has come up with modern slavery laws and legislation. India, as a matter of fact, has a corpus of labor laws uh, right from the Factory Act, which has been, of course, reformed, to, for example, the migrant workers law, or for example, the billing safety code, the compulsory social protection measures which are built into, for example, into the EPF challans, into the labor laws in India, for example. For example, if you have insurance or not, these things are built. The social protection measures are a part of the human rights context. Of course, we do not think of them as human rights because we think of them as workers' rights in an Indian context. Okay, so there are a few case studies which I want to draw your attention into at this point of time. Uh, there are palm oil plantations in Malaysia, which have been under the radar, the scrutiny for a poor human rights record, because they supply to the Fortune 500 FMCG companies, and there are huge plantation companies like uh, uh, in Malaysia who have faced a lot of issues regarding migrant worker supply chains in the sector, because a lot of the palm oil plantation labor come from Indonesia who work in Malaysia rather than Malaysian locals being there. And there are also expatriate workers from South Asia who work in these plantations. But once they are in the plantations, they do not have exactly the right worker well-being frameworks being applied to them, which should be applied to them if you are supplying to a Fortune 500 company which is listed in some other part of the world. So these are some of the complications. Of course, the palm oil sector has RSPO, which is the industry level human rights standard, and responsible supply chain standards over there. But this is again voluntary in nature. So the level of enforcement might be a bit wavering at times. So what really happens in human rights in the palm oil context is, as it is a labor-intensive industry, which requires hundreds of thousands of workers on a transnational basis. These transnational workers are essentially uh, mandated by local Malaysian labor law, but also transnational supply chain regulations such as RSPO, or for example, any ESG framework which is being met in other parts of the world. For example, if they are supplying palm oil, which is a input ingredient into shampoo, for example, in some other parts of the world. So it's a problematic thing if you do not take care of your supply chain workers. And recently, the supply chain plantation companies, the palm oil companies, have recently come up with remediation mechanisms to pay back a lot of their workers in case these workers have paid for recruitment cost. Recruitment cost is a concept in which workers from Bangladesh or from Indonesia or from India, they they normally pay an upfront cost in order to find work in Malaysia in a palm oil setting, which is completely against the United Nations conventions, and it is almost also a form of bribery to find a job. But it has been recently uncovered by these companies, and remediation mechanisms have been in place to identify these workers and to pay back these workers at least a limited amount of money for their remittance cost in terms of having a wage debt. How does it matter from a human rights perspective? Because these workers, when they pay up an upfront recruitment cost, either by mortgaging their family gold or silver or agricultural land, is all that they have in order to finance this kind of journey, precarious journey onto Malaysia, in order to work in Islam and plantation. So what happens is when you have this sort of wage debt, you are not free to work in an independent manner. If you have a humongous amount of debt to be paid back home, your ability to protest against unjust practices also reduces. So it's a vicious cycle, and has to be seen from a human rights sense. Why is it important from FMCG perspective or a palm oil perspective? Is because most of the oil which food is eaten globally is palm oil. So palm oil is important from uh, from a very extensive standpoint, and it's a very big industry. So and these are issues which are being dealt with, and has been a topic of transnational litigation. These companies being taken to court in other parts of the world, which impacts reputational capital, and reputational capital is very important for organizations which are publicly listed, which most of these companies are. The second case study that I want to foreground this discussion today is the critical mineral supply chains for transition. So we talk about net zero transition, net positive transitions all the time, right? We talk about EVs, we talk about EV vehicles, we talk about decarbonizing the grid, we talk about solar, we talk about wind, we talk about green hydrogen. But how do we operationalize these critical mineral value chains? How do we do this? Uh, of course, there needs to be the transmission line somewhere, right? There needs to be the substations, the transmission lines. There needs to be enough aluminum for solar panels, right? So there needs to be nickel for the solar panels. There needs to be critical minerals which are needed for battery storage, for the EVs, for example. So where do these minerals actually come from? These minerals come from mostly global south communities in Indonesia and sub-Saharan Africa, where which might even be a fragile state, which might mean it's a conflict mineral coming from somewhere, which ultimately the company which is making the EV vehicle or the solar panel does not have any idea about how these minerals are landing up in the value chain. In fact, recently Tesla, the world's leading EV vehicle manufacturer, is in fact has come up with a responsible supply chain initiative, which it tries to seek where do the minerals for the batteries come from, essentially. So, so conflict areas, conflict states are very complex in nature, and uh, and in these situations, operationalizing even the very basic human rights or worker welfare provisions is very complicated in these sort of states, because if your mineral comes from a conflict area, uh, how do you make sure that these are not the equivalent of blood diamonds, which are landing up in your retail stores or your supply chains globally? So, and human rights DD is very, very important because it makes sure that some proactive thought process is being made in order to take care of these vulnerable communities down in the supply chains. Of course, there's a lot of social performance standards in mining, for example. There's social impact assessments being held. There's human rights impact assessments, which are mandated as well by a lot of these companies. In fact, for a lot of oil exploration in Sudan, for example, human rights impact assessment is mandatory. Or, for example, in Myanmar, which are essentially conflict areas. So these are some of the things which are needed through a ESIA framework, through a human rights impact assessment, or for example, if you're procuring things, if you're buying things, the human rights due diligence is important as a part of the value chain. So the third case study which I want to bring in as of now is the garment workers in Tamil Nadu. Why is it important? Uh, and why are we talking about a case study from India? We might feel that we have adequate labor laws, we have adequate measures, we are in the era of the digital, where every small thing can get recorded and can be made viral on social media. So why are we talking about over here? So what happened is, according to research by professor at the University of Bath Business School, who works on human rights and supply chain accountability in garment supply chains in Tamil Nadu, and also it has been noted in the UN as well. Uh, these A cluster of garment workers, of women garment workers in Tamil Nadu, were had complained against the supervisor for unfair behavior, which also meant that a consignment of garments produced from that factory got confiscated by the United States under their supply chain regulations. So what that um, made sure that grievance redressal mechanism or a remediation mechanism got triggered, in which the ILO, uh, the US authorities, and also the um, um, uh, Indian garment workers and the company itself had to go through a remediation mechanism of trading, of compensation, and also making sure that these international standards are being applied on the ground, which entailed that the company got the name uh, of the list in the US, which would enable the company to manufacture for global brands. So human rights over here um, is our business at the end of the day, because if you don't adhere to certain um, human rights ethics and laws, your name will be struck off the list. Honestly, your name, and you won't be able to do business with the global high street brands, because some regulator sitting in the US or Europe will be keeping a note of the grievances which your workers might be making through grievance redressal mechanisms or through social media, which might be detrimental to your business, which you might not have thought is a predominant obstacle to your business ultimately. So these are the three case studies which uh, uh, I wanted to forefront this discussion on, and will now enter into the fine print of how to do an HRDD, how to do an HRIA, and why a human rights policy is important. So modern slavery legislations are a handful all over the world. In 2015, the UK Modern Slavery Act came into effect, followed by the Australian Modern Slavery Act. Recently, the US Uyghur legislations prohibiting any manufacturing good to be supplied to the US, which uses Uyghur forced labor, came into effect. Uh, and there are other laws as well, which are of course there, which includes laws from Germany, uh, which includes laws from Germany. For example, the Germany German Supply Chain Act, there was a Norwegian Transparency Act, the French accountability legislation. There is mandatory HRDD under the EU corporate sustainability disclosures, and the newest kid on the block is the supply chain law from Canada. And all of these bring companies into a so-called global regulatory landscape for human rights, which is very important in case you're exporting you're exporting metals, mining, garments, any manufactured good. Uh, these are these are in fact extremely these are in fact extremely important uh, to take care of. Okay. Um, so why is the human rights impact assessment and due diligence important? Of course, having foregrounded these, the talk through these case studies, I can definitely tell you that a human rights policy is a mandated thing. It is important for every investor and every company to have, in case they are a labor-intensive company, to respect all internationally recognized human rights to internal and external investment activities. It should serve as a basis for the investor approaches to human rights, which inform their operational policies and procedures, and which will make sure that uh, they will have some kind of screening for human rights indicators in their fund allocation process. And human rights due diligence should inform due diligence decision making at all stages of the investment process. HRDD, for example, should support investment selection and corrective action, particularly uh, because tomorrow your investment might be up for global scrutiny, which you wouldn't like to have in terms of global media backlash, or for example, an investment gone wrong, which will completely tarnish your reputation for good, which is not the best thing to do. A lot of human rights due diligences and ESG overall is a mechanism into reputation management, uh, which works for the organization, of course, but which also should mean something for the communities and for the employees at the end of the value chain. So these are the following elements for HRDD: identifying and assessing actual or potential adverse human rights impact with which investors may be involved with their own activities or investments through the value chain. Value chain is a very complex matter. It might involve tier one suppliers, or even further than the value chain, which the professor from Bath, who does work in garment chains, um, actually uh, has said that once you go down the value chain a bit, what really happens is uh, the the kind of scrutiny which the supply should have don't really have, because the tier one suppliers might be having ESG management systems. They might be having they might have embedded some kind of responsible controls in place. But for a small mom and pop shop, or for a small workshop to be supplying to the tier one supplier, which essentially supplies to a global brand, some things might be lost in translation. So those things are extremely important. And how do we do this? You first of all do an HRDD by making sure that what you want to check in an HRDD first. Secondly, how do you design the system to measure what you want to measure, for example? And once you're measured, how do you monitor what have you found out, observed, or measured? And how does it translate into remedial action for the for the investee company, for your own company? How does it make sure that you are doing enough to create a positive ripple effect for your business, as well as to protect you from all sorts of legal ramifications later on? So commitment to human rights is should be a three-part affair. First of all, establishing a human rights policy commitment. Secondly, is conducting a due diligence. Thirdly, is enabling or providing access to remedy. Establishing a policy is fairly simple. You have your internal team, or you hire an external consultant to write you a good human rights policy, which is benchmarked against all of the standards which I mentioned, which are local laws as well as international commitments. Uh, you write down a policy, then you have an SOP in place, and make sure how do you integrate it within your larger ESG management system. Secondly, how do you use that same policy, translate its ethos into a due diligence process, which is pre-transaction, during transaction, and how do you exit the asset if you feel that some things are going horribly wrong. And thirdly, if you find some things are going horribly wrong, how do you provide or enable access to a remedy is one of the ways, which is a powerful mechanism for human rights due diligence mechanisms. Because recently there have been case studies in published literature which shows that global brands have tapped into established remedial mechanisms to make sure that whoever has been affected due to poor human rights legislations and frameworks have been protected adequately, and they made successful exits to the business. And particularly these case studies have come from Thailand, Malaysia predominantly, where a lot of activist investors, these communities, banks have all focused a lot of this interest over there. So human rights policy, as I mentioned, should have uh, all the elements of um, the UN and the ILO conventions being mapped to them. They should be approved at the highest levels of the business. The policy should be translated into uh, management systems on the ground, and through tradings, having an awareness throughout your internal teams, your value chain teams, and your investing teams as well. At the same time, also make sure that the policy is being written by people who have relevant human rights expertise, and also integrated within the investment structure, within the everyday running of the business. And best is if it is available on the website of the company, to be accessed by and to be accessed to all the relevant parties and communicated accordingly. So for example, there might be a case in which there might be a human rights policy which is written according to the local anti-slavery law, such as in UK or Australia, but might not have the elements which are needed by the UNGPs, by the OECD due diligence rules, or the International Bill of Human Rights. So what do? You take your existing policy, take a help of an expert or a consultant, uh, incorporate relevant elements from these international policies into your existing human rights frameworks and your policies, and you upgrade it. One more area which is very, very common, especially among SMEs, is they might have a whistleblowing policy, which which is inclusive of only internal employees only. So the best practice is to open a grievance redressal mechanism or the whistleblowing policy to cover internal and external stakeholders and investment employees as well. Uh, there also might be a case where the supply code of conduct only covers investors with direct business relationships only. Preferably, it should cover all indirect and direct aspects of the business, including throughout the value chain. Um, the policy structure, the existing policy structure might contain uh, a structure which might not be specific for human rights, which is which is obviously quite common, uh, and make sure that your policy commitment, including your governance structure, management systems, operational SOPs in place, has a reference to human rights risk and impact, which it can be made operational, which can be made accountable for evaluation. So stakeholder engagement is a very, very important part of how you do a human rights due diligence. So these might be direct stakeholder groups, which might include employees, labor union representatives, local communities, vulnerable indigenous groups, or consumer interest groups as well. Uh, why are the reasons to engage? Because these are the people who are directly involved in your day-to-day business and your value chain. So essentially including them is also establishing a social license to operate, which essentially means that they have a buy-in into an understanding of why this business is being done the way it is being done. There are also industry initiatives in place, which might mean that uh, if you're in mining, for example, there are critical and responsible mining standards in place for mining majors to adhere to, especially when it comes to human rights. There might be responsible business alliance, RBA, strictures which are involved in electronic supply chain manufacturers. Uh, as mentioned for palm oil in Malaysia and Indonesia, there is RSPO. So these are industry groups which come up with their own frameworks for for the participants to adhere to. So there are international human rights NGOs which play a major role in this ecosystem. It might be the Danish Institute of Human Rights. It might be the IHRB, Institute of Human Rights in Business. It might be Human Rights Watch, Transparency International, Oxfam, and the list goes and on and on and on. And these are very important watchdogs, essentially, including Market Watch, to make sure that the right human rights frameworks are being used, and if they're being used, they are not being uh, uh, just done for greenwashing as per se, because a lot of times a lot of policies are there, but they result in the same outcomes in case the policies are not there in place. So there are national human rights commissions in place, such as in India. There are ombudsmen, uh, which are industry specific as well. And in an Indian context, it might be somebody who is a very respected judge of a Supreme Court or a High Court being appointed to sort out an issue in terms of dispute resolutions. And there are, of course, local and national laws and ministries which deal with affairs of labor, social, community, and human rights. In India, there might be the Ministry of Social Justice, Ministry of Labor. So there are central ministries, and there are regional ministries, and there are also stakeholders at the local level. So, so stakeholder mapping is important because a company needs to cover as many direct and indirect parties who are being affected by the business or the value chain of the organization. And once you can map who are directly or indirectly being affected through an investment or through actually through consumer support or through buying activities, uh, it provides the company leverage and power for mitigation, prevention, and remediation of human rights impacts if they are there. Assessing through open source research and direct engagement is an essential way of finding the potential impacts or the liability of the investment impact, which is there on the human rights lens. And we might think of human rights as a standalone element, as a single issue element, but often in an ESG or in a responsible business landscape, environmental and social and governance issues are entangled and intertwined in ways in which are not very transparent and visible. So a human rights issue might be also a health and safety issue, also a community risk issue from a IFC Performance Standard 4 perspective. So, um, so once stakeholder mapping is done, it's very important to ensure that there are open and flexible channels of communication between the communities, employees, the investment fund, and the company. So trust building is hugely important in this context. How to establish trust is a very important way of making sure that your human rights or your worker welfare activities are being implemented on the ground, and the right effects of your interventions um, are being actualized. So this is a sample stakeholder human rights impact matrix in which the x-axis has the severity of human rights impacts, and the y-axis is how much of leverage do these stakeholders have in terms of assessing or having been impacted by this human rights impact. So these might be the number one is of course employees. Secondly is the local community as always. There might be vendors in your value chain. There might be what impact of your human rights policies the investment fund is happening is a very high level of impact. The local community for the same, and there are activist groups or their watchdogs, which I spoke about in the previous slides, which are also being a part of this very important ESG ecosystem. So the HRDD funnel is the same as any ESGDD funnel, which is assess and identify and assess the risk in a pre-transaction format. When the transaction is happening, make sure that these identified risks are being prevented and mitigated. If there's a period in which investments happen and in which there's a regular assessments or audits happen on the social and human rights end to make sure that progress happens in terms of human rights indicators uh, and in terms of community buy-in as well, which is obviously tracked in an MEL fashion, monitoring and evaluation fashion, and also communicated to the right stakeholders, including regulators, investors, and the community. And of course, when you exit, you do a due diligence to make sure that you don't have any trace risks for your investment previously. So human rights risk identification is a structured tool and technique. Uh, there is a need for macro level, country and sectoral value chain risk assessment and analysis, which is a desktop level study in which you pick up country risk reports, you do extensive open source intelligence mining on the internet, where you see uh, where you find out words and syntaxes across search engines for the past 25 years using AI search engines, maybe, and you find it out and you find out the risk. You talk to experts in the geography, in the field, you do your due diligence. There is, of course, a need for on the ground reporting in case if you find from your desktop review that there are triggers which will be material enough, which will be significant enough for your investments. And of course, there is continuous assessment as well, whether you have invested or not invested. So risk identification is important because the nature of the sector, the context is everything in this. So in fact, if you are dealing with the solar sector, you think about where are your solar panels coming from? Are they coming from value chains from Xinjiang in China? Are they being built by forced labor somewhere? Uh, so you look at those, because solar industry or mining is quite rife with human rights risks. Uh, you also look at your home country of investor. Uh, for example, the Norwegians are very uh, strict about human rights risks, as do other European and Scandinavian investors, uh, or even Germany, which has a supply chain law right now. So, depending upon which country fund is being looked at into, their social, cultural, and economic factors might impact the way that human rights is treated uh, in a particular context, because some countries have higher intolerance of inequality, or, for example, graft. Uh, the presence of vulnerable populations in your intervention context or in the investment context is also very important. For example, if you have minorities or migrant workers or indigenous communities, for example, if a fund wants to invest in a solar park in the middle of nowhere where there are South Asian migrant laborers, uh, that might be a problem from a resettlement action plan perspective, because these workers might not have any job uh, in, in the presence of the solar park, for example. So there are also issues of discrimination. There are also issues about persecution as well. So it might be a very complicated issue to be operating in a context in which it's very politically volatile. For example, in Myanmar, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, where most of these mines are. So for new or existing project, you do a social impact assessment, you do a resettlement action plan, you have a sustainable procurement model, you have a local community social contract plan in place, a community development plan, uh, in order to identify this risk, and also making sure that you build a social license to operate in the intervention context. So it is a very complicated value chain most of the times, which might go beyond your tier one suppliers, where most of the problems might lie. So that's where the challenge is for most human rights consultants, as well as for investment funds and clients as well. And that's a bottleneck which has to be made sure the black box is unpacked over there. So the value chain mapping, as I mentioned, it is more than tier one suppliers, and most of the problem comes from beyond the tier one. So how these challenges are being mapped is a certain significant intellectual challenge as well for investors and for companies. And and as I mentioned that there is a need for a lot of brainstorming and for a lot of deep in-depth assessments for these risks to be identified in a complicated value chain such as solar. So, so last but not the least, it's a sample human rights risk register over here, which I wanted to show that these are some of the things which companies can do very easily in order to intellectually, qualitatively map their human rights risk. Prominently, these can be health and safety breaches. This can be a lack of respect for labor rights. This can be potential disputes with local communities. These are the high-level risks which are being talked about. And of course, there is in the impacts register, of course, you have severity, likelihood, risk level, and also the sector, and also the country. So this is qualitative in nature, taken from a major bank, a major Dutch bank called ABN AMRO, which does human rights risk assessment. And this is something which they have been doing for years in order to qualitatively high level identify what are the risks in case they have potential for disputes in communities which they have to redress, or health and safety breaches. So how do you do in-depth assessments? You do in-depth assessments because your desktop assessment shows that it's beyond the severity threshold. Uh, an investor considers that uh, this might this might line up the investment in a stress asset or in a stuck asset mold, and it also means that some things are not being captured by existing due diligence techniques, which might means that you might have to send out an NGO team to do in-depth human rights ethnographic risk assessments for the value chain, which is not really possible through high-level open source intelligence work, um, database reviews, or even satellite mapping. This might actually need boots on the ground, as they say. So, for example, a consultant might have to go and interview these impacted communities, uh, find out what is the real issue, and because most of these issues which happen beyond tier one are very complicated in nature. So, an appreciation of nuance, an appreciation of culture, of history, is very, very important, because in conflict zones such as Ethiopia, for example, which are major producers of coffee, which we all love, uh, companies are doing this in-depth assessment to see whether the impacted communities are not a business risk for them. So these are some of the things which are very, very important. And by the way, it's not only solar or mining, it's also coffee, which is uh, heavily impacted by human rights risk and violations, and there are other sectors as well. So it's a complicated terrain. It's a terrain which is emerging, which is exploding at its seams, which is bursting at its seams, and there are a lot of transnational risks which will eventually emerge, which companies would have to find redressal to, along with the climate risk. In fact, climate risk and human rights risk are joined at the hip many a time, because both of them talk about inequality, both of them talk about being unfairly treated, both of them talk about something which has gone wrong. So in-depth assessments are needed very much in case the desktop reviews or the qualitative reviews show that it's not enough. So in-depth reviews include interviews with the management, interviews with the labor unions, interviews with the supply chain, having a look at the working conditions, and also making sure that the audit systems and the management systems are in place. For any further discussion on this, we can have it during the discussion. So some of the sample metrics for the HRDDs are very interesting. This can be the percentage of employees being covered by collective bargaining agreements in terms of labor rights, the number of days not worked due to strikes or blackouts, uh, the the percentage of salary wages received during leaves of absence, for example, percentage of male and female employees, whether there is a pay parity over there, um, if there is any forced labor in the value chain. Of course, health and safety is bread and butter, but health and safety is a very important human rights metric. So number of reported accidents or incidents, number of days lost due to injuries or illnesses, uh, percentage of training, employees trained in health and safety, and average time and cost to resolve health and safety incidents and accidents are major key sample metrics for human rights due diligence. As mentioned, human rights is not vague, it is very much quantifiable. And of course, DEI is a different basket, it's a different silos within HRDDs as well. So you talk about the number of disabled employees, you talk about how many minority populations are there, what is the composition of your board, how many part-time employees are there, what is the retrenchment ratio, which speaks a lot about the company often So these are the indicators which are a ready reckoner for HRDDs anywhere in the world. So the last slide over here, we boil down to that HRDDs are a proactive measure to manage risk in value chains. Uh, it's an opportunity to create provisions for worker welfare and go beyond compliance. It is an opportunity for companies to show that they are concerned about the employees and the supply chain, and also an avenue to go beyond the tick box social license to operate paradigm to a social value paradigm, which takes the impact imperative to the next level. So thank you very much for your attention and time this afternoon, evening, or morning, wherever you're tuning in from. Right now, we have a small poll, online poll, which my team will share for you to participate, and hopefully we should have a nice discussion after this.
Participants can now raise their hands or post their questions in the chat box or even unmute themselves and ask any kind of questions or queries related to human rights or due diligence.
Well, I would love to have a few points in which we can have a dialogue and a conversation. I can see a few familiar names for our webinars from our previous webinars over here. So, um, first of all, welcome, Mac, and also welcome to participants who have joined us for the first time in our webinar series.
Hello, Monishankar Da. This is Abhijit from Cube Highways.
Hi, Abhijit. Thank you for joining us back. You are certainly a familiar face.
Yeah, it is certainly it's a privilege to hear you. So I would never leave this opportunity, obviously. It's so much learning. So thank you for this wonderful session. And I fully agree with you that these human rights are very important for any business, and especially when you have multiple vendors, like we are working in infrastructure category. So we have multiple vendors, multiple locations, multiple communities, multiple backgrounds that we are facing, and it is very important to include all these points in your DD. And currently we are doing, but yes, there is a on a larger level, but on minute level, like as per IFC standards, we are doing it. But yes, there are certain issues that we come up after acquiring the projects or uh, uh, after giving the work to a particular vendor. Then after completing all the hardship, and when you get to know that there are certain challenges related to whether it's an accommodation for the workers, whether it's their transportation, or whether it's their safety, or whether their benefits that they need as per labor laws and everything. So yes, those challenges are we are addressing. But on a larger scale, if I see, especially on in manufacturing and in infra companies, these are not addressed. Especially there are many Indian companies with big names. I won't take those names, but yes, it is not being addressed. So yes, I fully agree that they need to be addressed properly.
Thank you so much, Abhijit, for this valuable observation. I just wanted to ask you something, as you're working in the infrastructure space for such a long time and you are a very senior environmental and social professional. Uh, what exactly are the interventions that you do in case if you find uh, that you might be having some friction with a community, for example, or from your workforce? How do you actually resolve the grievances at that level during the operation, rather, because you are an operations oriented company?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. So in related to communities, for example, there are certain people who have political backgrounds. There are certain people who tend to find they don't want to follow the rules, and they want to rule over you. So their one-to-one dialogues has to be conducted, and some mediators has to be included. Sometimes we include some mediators as well, some consultants, some NGOs, uh, to know the exact scenario and how we can address them. Actually, we have a very strong DD in-house DD process, and while we acquire any project, so before acquiring, we thoroughly conduct these all DD issues. We thoroughly properly do the due diligence, and but yes, there are few things which are not in our hand. Uh, there we face issues, but with communities, one-to-one dialogue is very important. Then you have to go there, you have to uh, discuss with them. Focused group discussions are required, so we do all these things. And there are certain requirements of the community as well, because sometimes there is a previous vendor or who was doing the work and community was not happy with them. So you have to basically tell them that we are not the same guys, we are someone else, we have a different perspective. So some CDP activities are required, some CSR activities are required. So all those things we take care. Even we would like to tell you that we are setting up smart classes in the schools, government schools, which are nearby on our infrastructure projects. So earlier we used to do. There are many activities, that free drilling center, free computer centers we are providing, free coaching to the students. Even 10,000 rupees scholarship every year we are providing on Independence Day on all our projects to 20 to 30 students on each project. So that's been going on, but now we are taking it to next level, providing sports kits, providing books, setting up libraries in the schools. So all those things that actual people, they get to know. Then all these political frictions and everything, now it gets it doesn't hinder you anymore. So that kind of things, that a new perspective you have to bring on the table, so that a larger community can understand. Yes, they are focused on fundamental things, fundamental rights to education, safety of children, awareness regarding the road safety, all those things that we are doing on all projects. And we include the administration as well. Including administration gives you a pat on the back from administration and as well. If there is a bad guy in the community who is not happy to see that you are doing the right work, by having admin on your side, it gives you a stronger sense to do the job better, and not afraid to of the local guys that we normally see in India. So that's one with the community. The other related to internal issues, we have strong grievance mechanism. We have in-house audit, internal audit team as well. I'm also one of the member, and I do E&S audits to all our sites. And there is the audit team, there is a compliance team. So there are 3 4 mechanisms that we have set up. If someone misses one thing, then other will surely catch. So these kind of audits and inspections we surely do at all our projects.
That's very, very informative, Vijay. Thank you so much for your valued comments and also insights in terms of a case study, right? Because what is done on the ground and what is done at the consultant level, there's usually a gap, and it's excellent to learn from a practical standpoint about how environmental and social compliance activities, especially the S S compliance activities, are happening on the ground, because a lot of S is about taking care, is about worker welfare, community welfare at the end of the day, through CSR, through other interventions as well. Thank you so much, Abhijit,
Yes.
for your time and
Thank you.
and
Yes.
for your comments as well. I would like to invite I would like to invite any other member of the audience, the participants, to ask, to deliberate, to reflect upon what we have spoken about in the past 1 hour 15 minutes. If there are no further comments or intervention for the same.
Sir, there is one question from Mr. Mehul Patel.
Yes.
Please elaborate on grievance mechanism open for all, why it is important beyond employees.
Yeah, grievance redressal open for all is important because usually risks happen when from unexpected sources. From within the employees is very uh, from within employees is very easy to manage, honestly speaking. But there has to be open channels with the community, with your vendors, in the event of a small trigger which can really uh, inflame, or it can go beyond your control, because nowadays uh, a lot of people are affected by even the smallest things. And normally what happens is, if you are affected by those very small things, uh, and these are not captured by any small weak signal or a strong signal mechanism, it can be really detrimental to your web business. So it's better to have a open grievance redressal or a whistleblower mechanism, uh, because it's better to know the problem than to not know the problem and later on see the problem really flare up or amplify and hit you in your face, kind of a situation. That's not ideal at all. By the way, many thanks, Mr. Patel, for the intervention.
I have one question. I just want to understand, when you talk about all the human rights assessment, due diligence, and everything, we've seen that majorly all this factors in more in industries or places, sectors that are labor intensive. Now, if we look at this from the perspective of an IT or a financial sector, where definitely people are involved there, so what would be your take in, perspective to those sectors? How are we, if somebody from an IT wants to get in, a human rights risk assessment done, or from a financial services, then how would you go about it?
Thank you so much for this excellent probe. Uh, well, human rights impact assessment and due diligences are context specific. They are uh, well, all businesses are made up of people, right? Ultimately, and they are a stock and a set of conversations ultimately. So, if you talk about an IT sector or a financial services sector, of course, there is human rights risk over there of a different kind. Like, for example, if you talk about IT organization or a technology organization, there are issues to deal with cyberbullying, cyber trolling. There are issues to deal with data privacy. There are cybersecurity issues. There are issues to deal with DEI. There are issues to deal with pay parity, for example. So every sector will have its own material set of considerations vis-a-vis HRDDs, and IT also has its own peculiar context. Uh, Even if they are a service sector, even they are in the knowledge and innovation space, they are not oblivious to HR risk, right? Human rights risk. So that's important. From a financial services risk, of course, even if you provide a loan to an SME, that exposes you to human rights risks as well. So yeah, there are diverse set of considerations vis-a-vis HRDDs, both for technology and for financial services.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
There is another question from Mr. Mehul Patel. Whistleblower managed by company or third party, which is recommended. Why?
Whistleblowers should always be managed by a third party ombudsman, which means you should have a Jan Lokpal, which is independent to your organization, which should be. And by the way, there are organizations in Southeast Asia which uh, provide outsourced grievance redressal mechanism services, which run very well based on technology. They will run it on behalf of you, but they will ensure that a firewall is in place between your company and the vendor, which is running the ombudsman. It's always better to have a third party in terms of having a ombudsman. Thank you, Mr. Patel. In case if you want to have a discussion further into how to design your grievance redressal mechanisms or your ombudsman, please drop us a mail. We would be happy to have a conversation with you.
I think so. There are no more questions from the participants. So, thank you, everyone. Thank you, sir, for joining us today. Hope it was an insightful session, and we look forward to your participation in all our upcoming webinars in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, all of you, for your time. And the recording of our webinar will be up on our social media channels very, very soon. Thank you so much once again. Have a nice weekend.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.